Before we dive into this episode, we wanted to remind our listeners of the contest we launched to wrap up our first year of episodes. We want to showcase the up-and-coming ideas in the world of planning and design that will hopefully gain traction and make their way back onto our podcast as a book review episode. Are you going to be the person who comes up with a groundbreaking idea like new urbanism or form-based code? For more information on the contest, the deadlines, and the prizes in the two categories, student and practicing professional, head to bookedonplanning.com/contest. This is Booked on Planning, a bi-weekly podcast that breaks down the world we live in by paging through current and classic books. I'm Steph Rouse, and my co-host for this episode is Jennifer Hyatt. Our guest today is Jaimie Hicks Masterson, author of Planning for Community Resilience. Jaimie is a certified planner and director of the Texas Target Communities at Texas A&M University. She's the engagement coordinator for the Institute for Sustainable Communities in the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard project, and also consults with small communities to develop comprehensive plans, economic development plans, and other planning needs to fold and infuse resilience practices into community initiatives. Thank you, Jaimie, for joining us for this episode on your book, Planning for Community Resilience. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, and why you decided to write this book?
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me again on the podcast. I'm a certified urban planner. I'm a practitioner. I also am a researcher here at Texas A&M University. I'm also the director of a program we have called Texas Target Communities, and we work with communities across the state, typically low capacity communities, and we assist them with different unmet needs that they might have. And unfortunately, it's something that's very easy to do in Texas is work with communities that are vulnerable to different types of disaster. So mostly we are working and listening and learning from communities on the ground and then incorporating that into our research. And so that was really a big impetus for the book. And when we first wrote it, it was back in 2014 is when it was published, but it all began really with Hurricane Ike in 2008. And the other co-authors on the book, immediately began, documenting what was going on. That was a direct hit on Galveston Island, which is along the Texas coast. And we are about 90 miles, 100 miles from that. And so that research, along with the practice and the working with communities throughout the state and throughout the Gulf Coast, we found that we had a lot of knowledge and experience and began sort of pouring it into a training program that we developed with the American Planning Association. And so before it was a book, it was actually a 2-day workshop for planners.
Excellent. Thank you. And so Stephanie and I are located in Nebraska, where the main disasters that we typically think of are flooding and tornadoes. And previous to probably, say, 6 years ago, I'm not sure Nebraska planners were as familiar with disaster planning. I'm sure there were certain people who were starting in the niche. Who was your target audience for this book when you were thinking about prepping it in 2008, moving through to 2014?
So all of the authors on the books were planners. So we come from that background, from that lens, and we saw this gap in the field that, while emergency managers are doing an excellent job with the response and preparedness, really there are things that local governments in the planning and development areas should be focusing on. And so really our main audience was for community planners. And while they might not have, the specific expertise in hazards like emergency managers, they are experts on the community's built environment. And we know that how and where we build matters. And so we know that planners need to be playing a greater role in thinking through these issues. But beyond planners, I think there's still something in the book for others in local government, regional governments, even our state governments could be learning from, but primarily those who are informing policies, they're decision makers. They could be emergency managers as well, economic development directors, city engineers, floodplain managers. I think our elected officials could benefit from this. And we do have quite a bit in the book on things that, how residents can get involved in sort of everyday actions of community organizers to be more proactive about this in their community.
Yeah, actually, one of my favorite aspects of your book is in different chapters, you have a chart of who's the responsible actor, what actions should they be taking, how can they break that down? And almost every section of every chart has citizens in general. And you talk about how they're really the first responders. We think of first responders more as, the police or emergency managers or EMTs, but really it is the citizen next door that's your first responder. And I thought that was a really poignant takeaway that I don't think a lot of planners consider when they're thinking about disaster management. So thank you for including that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's another reason why planners can play a greater role, because I think something we're very good at is convening different types of folks together. We have the tools to have participatory processes in place to get public or, larger scale community input. And so, there's a lot of tools that planners have that are conducive to getting the citizens and residents involved in these kinds of processes. And those who are impacted by a disaster are always the first to respond. We do have first responders who are professional first responders, but as we see these volunteer groups emerging in Hurricane Harvey, the Cajun Navy was this big spontaneous volunteer group going out to provide search and rescue. And so there's a lot more than just what an emergency manager can do. There's just so much. It really takes a whole community effort, I think, to respond to disasters and also think thoughtfully about mitigating them and reducing our risk.
Let's kind of start digging in a little bit into the substance of the chapters. And I thought you made a great point. I come from a humanities background, so the definition of resilience for me was a little different. So just to make sure that we have everyone on the podcast on the same page, can you start with how you define resiliency in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So the disaster literature has really come from, I would say, the field of ecology. And we really have built on that as a way to understand ecosystems, how they're able to absorb shocks and then adapt and, evolve essentially. And so a lot of the definitions that you will see about resilience is really coming from ecological perspectives. And it's really fascinating if you get, into the weeds about it. But there's this idea called the adaptive cycle by Holling and Gunderson. And if you can kind of envision the infinity symbol and the sort of idea that a population is sort of growing, it's taking advantage of resources, it's maybe not as concerned about risks, right? And then there's this point at sort of the top of the infinity symbol, right, that they begin to conserve their resources. They're becoming more aware of the risks. And then there is an inevitable collapse when there's either, too much pressure on that population, or there's some sort of external shock that forces them into the sort of collapse of that species or that population. And then, what we hope emerges from that is a reorganization and a way to adapt and learn from how those risks were taken into effect and how to take better use of the resources available. So that's the kind of framework, I think, that a lot of now when we think about resilience, that's what we're thinking about. So in terms of a community perspective, it really still applies, but our definition is kind of about, and you'll see lots of definitions out there. They're all very, very similar, But it's basically about a community's ability to resist and absorb different impacts. So in this case, it's hazards, right? And your then ability to rapidly recover from those impacts. So how quickly can you get back to that baseline level? And then what would be the most important piece to all of this is then how you can then reduce future vulnerabilities and how you're able to incorporate adaptive strategies or adapt to those circumstances that you've just gone through, or ones that you can sort of project or potential future risks as well. So that's kind of how we think about resilience in the field.
And I know in the book you've put together kind of these 4 phases for how planners or just people in general can help communities start becoming more resilient. So would you mind taking us through those 4 phases, and specifically, of course, how planners can kind of fit into each of those, but also community at large or government leaders?
Yeah, there are 4 phases in disaster management, and they have evolved over the years. And so if you can kind of envision the idea of a professional in disaster management has changed over the years. And originally, right, the whole purpose in the field was to respond to the disaster itself. So that is one of the key phases, is disaster response. And you see that in our fire, search and rescue folks, right? They're about saving lives. So the disaster response, the Cajun Navy that I just mentioned before, those are the folks that are out who are in the event itself, trying to save lives and get people to safety. And there is really great literature on how to just do that. It really comes from more of a military command and control style. There's a whole system in place called incident command system. And it's the sort of hierarchy of who's in control, how we should communicate, and how we can get resources out so we can save lives quicker and faster. The response is great, but then you have to sort of prepare for the response. So then that was another whole aspect that was developed and sort of professionalized, is what's called disaster preparedness. So emergency managers are developing plans. They're having lots of conversations with lots of different types of groups and stakeholders and decision makers on what they need to do to prepare just for the response itself. So those 2 phases of the disaster cycle are really event specific. They're thinking about different scenarios. They're thinking about, okay, if we have earthquake of this magnitude, this is how we need to respond, or a tornado of this magnitude. And so they come up with different scenarios depending on the different potential risks. And then over the years, there's been more and more literature and necessity to focus on, of course, disaster recovery. So it's great. We saved lives, but our community is still in a terrible state. It's many structures, economic loss, and damage. So what can we do to speed the actual recovery after the disaster? And there's the short-term recovery, where we're thinking about how to temporarily house folks, getting them into hotels, or what folks probably can think about when they think of short-term recovery is like FEMA trailers, right? How do we get them into just these temporary living conditions where they can kind of get back on their feet? And then we get into the more long-term recovery of the community, which is trying to rebuild and get back basically to where we were before. And that can take many, many years, depending on the magnitude of the disaster and the resources available. So those are been the 3 big thrusts. But what I haven't mentioned yet, and what I think is the most important, and the role in which planners can play the biggest role, is hazard mitigation. And hazard mitigation is basically, what can we do to reduce our risks altogether? What structural infrastructure or structural mitigation measures need to be in place so we can absorb the shocks? Or what can we do to just get out of harm's way? So if you notice, the disaster recovery piece and the hazard mitigation piece of the cycle, those are really about the built environment. They're really about how we're building and rebuilding after the disaster, getting back on our feet. And hazard mitigation is really about how can we strengthen the structures that we do have or strategically avoid disaster or hazard exposures. So these two elements of the disaster cycle, I think, are really the areas in which planners need to play a bigger role.
And this could be partly because I'm from the Midwest, where we're maybe not seeing quite as big of the disasters. We do get the tornadoes, but it seems to me that hazard mitigation is relatively new in planning, but we've had disasters forever. So what do you think has kind of brought both the planning groups and then also everybody else into play now? What do you think was the catalyst for really starting to bring hazard mitigation to the forefront?
So with the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, that was really a sort of a federal, piece of legislation passed that stated that, in order to receive different types of funding so that you can recover, so that way you can invest and put back into your public infrastructure and structures, you have to develop a hazard mitigation plan. So before that time, there was no sort of requirement or charge to develop hazard mitigation plans. And so now all of a sudden you saw emergency managers having to figure out how to develop a hazard mitigation plan. And so when you look at hazard mitigation plans today, they still skew toward the more response and preparedness types of actions that you would see in emergency management, and less of the types of policies that could potentially inform the built environment, land use policies, and that kind of thing. So over the last 20 years, it's been a requirement. And then you're seeing, I think emerging from that, emergency managers realizing that they need a little bit more assistance from other partners in order to make that hazard mitigation plan a reality. And it's something that they have to do. They have to get it recertified every 5 years. So I think that's been a big push, as well as the reason for that legislation was just the amount of money we were, as a country, spending on rebuilding and the damages and losses from large scale disaster events. And so, that certainly had an impact and influence on what can we do ahead of time to save money and not have to pour as much into the actual rebuilding process.
You said that the hazard mitigation still, even today, kind of still focuses more on the recovery and response and less on the land use and stuff. Do you think that that's partly because hazard mitigation professionals are more familiar with that? They have that better history, background, understanding? Or do you think that there's still a lot of tension with landowners, and a lot of times the landowners or the land in question typically does tend to be kind of higher value, quote unquote, land.
Right.
So do you think there's some tension there, or is it really more just that it's taking them some more time to turn their attention to land use?
No, I think it's both of those things. I think you're kind of hitting on a really interesting point that yes, our emergency managers are not trained in land use policies, those types of tools that are available that could help reduce risks. So there's some siloing that's going on between different professions. And really, there are tools that the emergency management community can use from planning for their efforts. But the point you're making about property owners, yes, is a huge piece to this. When you are in a community and you are having to sit down with someone and tell them that they cannot rebuild their home without raising it 3 feet off the ground, and they're looking at you and crying because they cannot afford to do that, that changes your perspective, and it changes how it's more complicated, sort of socially, emotionally, than I think we recognize. And I think local governments are doing the very best that they can to make sure that those laws are being passed, but it still takes an emotional toll on those who are trying to enforce those laws. And I think that's not been something that's been talked about enough and researched enough and incorporated into options and choices for people who are having to make those tough decisions. So definitely, in my mind, an area that needs more exploration and attention.
And then along that line of conversation, how can communities on the front end start assessing their potential for hazard exposure?
So hazard exposure, it's essentially looking at the risks that you might have to various hazards. So you mentioned you're from the Midwest. So every community is going to have different sets of risks to different types of hazards. So you're first sort of identifying what are you at risk to, and your emergency managers will have this information because they're developing those hazard mitigation plans. They have that data and information. They're usually from federal or state data sets, and it's something, that you can incorporate into your own planning efforts, whatever types of plans, community plans you're developing. I would also say, though, there is a lot of great local knowledge, which you can also utilize while you're working with residents and citizens. You can understand some of the more fine-grained hazards that are impacting folks. And just in my work, community members will say, well, no, this street is the street that really floods, and we get flooding here every so often. That's not documented necessarily on the FEMA flood maps, the NFIP insurance rate maps. But if we know that that's what's going on, then we can kind of incorporate that into the decisions that we're making for land use, right? So I wouldn't discount that sort of local knowledge. And I think that's an important question as you're engaging with community members on the topic. Additionally, I would just say that hazard exposures are also inherently spatial. Not all hazards are, right? It's a little harder to predict tornadoes, and it's harder to predict sort of winter storms and those kinds of things. But the ones that you can spatially predict, like flooding, like storm surge, earthquakes, have a fairly good prediction model, as well as now wildfire has a really good prediction model. Those things, to just map them, makes what you do as a community planner that much more useful and helpful for those land use decisions.
Speaking of community work, you made me think of the city of Lincoln put together a climate action plan. I've been seeing more communities at least take interest in climate as it relates to hazard mitigation. How do you see maybe a climate action plan and a comprehensive plan working together with the hazard mitigation response and plan?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And there's lots of different types of climate action plans out there. And I do appreciate them in looking more holistically at climate, sea level rise, but also sort of like the drought and urban heat and some of those aspects as well. The concern potentially is the way that they are not interacting with the comprehensive plan or the hazard mitigation plan. So it is critical that those documents are working hand in hand, that they are referencing one another, that they are utilizing policies and action items or projects and strategies from those different plans. I would say that because the hazard mitigation plan is a sort of a federal requirement and tied to funding, that hazard mitigation plan should probably be amended to include different actions and policies that were in the climate adaptation plan. So just making sure that there's a strong connection back to those funding streams. And then same with the comprehensive plan, I would hope that the comprehensive plan would also be amended or have those same policies incorporated into it, so that city councils and elected officials and staff, when they're developing their capital improvement plans and budgets, that they are incorporating those strategies and projects into them. So there has to be that strong coordination across those different plans.
And now that we have touched on plans, what, in your opinion, makes a really good hazard mitigation plan?
Yeah, there is some great literature out there on looking at the different types of plans. We assessed a number of plans across the Gulf Coast. And then more recently, we've gone up the East Coast, every county along the coastline, looking at their hazard mitigation plans. There are really 7 elements that you'll typically see in a hazard mitigation plan. Typically, it starts with a vision statement, which is pretty typical in planning, right? Then they talk through their planning process, how they engaged community members. I'll say that in general, this is lacking. And I would like to see more public participation in that process. But I think that's, again, where planners can come in. The third element you'll see is usually the fact basis, and this is the largest portion of a hazard mitigation plan. It is many, 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 many pages of all the risks that the community has. And typically they're written out, but what we want to see is those mapped out. So the best hazard mitigation plans are going to have a strong sort of GIS or mapping component, and obviously the finer grain detail, the better. So a really detailed understanding of different risks, but we would want to also see some thought to potential future risks. That's harder to do. It is not necessarily, there aren't federal data sets for your future risk, but I think there's some really great work that consultants and researchers are doing to develop what could be, 20 years from now, what we would be looking at to give an idea for folks. The fourth element you'll typically see is mitigation goals and objectives, which is, again, we are in our planning efforts, we're always identifying those goals and objectives. And then there will be typically a section on interorganizational coordination. And this is a way where they can identify different agencies and different departments and how they're cooperating and organizing together. This section tends to be a little weaker in our research, as well as the fact basis has tended to be relatively weak. So there is more that could be done and said on the way in which we're coordinating and organizing the sort of efforts. And I think that goes back to this field and the idea of disaster planning in urban planning or in city and regional planning as sort of having emerged, I would say, over the last decade or so. The sixth element you'll typically see is policies and action items, and they'll usually do this by city. So typically you'll have a county-wide plan or sometimes even a regional plan, and they'll have the different cities within that county or within that region sort of participating in this larger planning effort. And they'll have these separate amendments or separate sections just for the city's policies. This is by far the weakest part of every hazard mitigation plan from our research perspective. And it's really because of the lack of land use policies and the full portfolio of policies that communities could utilize are really not being utilized. We see a lot of policies really just on awareness, education. There is a lot on specific sort of public infrastructure or facilities to upgrade, but you don't see the types of policies that you would see in a comprehensive plan or that planners often use. So there's definitely room for improvement there. And then the final section of the plan is typically about implementation and how they're going to update the plan and monitor it. So those are the typical categories that we're seeing and areas for improvement across hazard mitigation planning.
Yeah, I think to your point about interagency communication, that's definitely something that I feel like our community is struggling with, because we had a planner sit on the advisory board that was developing the county plan a couple of years ago. And that was about all our involvement is and all the involvement has been. And I think there's definitely opportunity because we're working on our climate action plan of trying to integrate those better and work to be a little more prepared.
Right. Yeah, it is such a huge effort. And to do it every 5 years, it's no wonder, why there's not as much engagement. I don't really know what the solution there is, but there needs to just be more coordination with the planners in what they are doing. We were working on a research project with the city of Nashua, New Hampshire, and they were up for their hazard mitigation plan. And they also wanted to develop a resilience plan. And so they decided to sort of bring this large stakeholder group together and do both at the same time. And then they were going to utilize what they did with those planning efforts in order to then update and launch a whole new comprehensive planning effort afterwards. So it was really fantastic to see the emergency manager sort of leading the way on that and bringing the planners to the table, because he saw the benefit and value of having the city and regional planners participating and having that direct connection and continuity to the comprehensive plan. I think there's a way that we can be hitting multiple birds at one time, right? Or we don't all have to be working in silos. If we can figure out how to coordinate all of our requirements and initiatives together, I think we can streamline some of the efforts.
I think that that's maybe the biggest problem in planning in general is we each have our own little areas and we each have our own little silos, and we typically struggle to leave them.
Yes.
So I think that's excellent advice for all planners in every aspect of planning.
Yes.
Finally, I work in land use law, and I understand that consistency and predictability are the keys to the kingdom when you're trying to do anything. So one of your final takeaways in the books was that consistency is vital to disaster management, and it really struck a chord for me. So can you speak a little bit on why consistency is so important?
Yeah, actually, and I'll say that we've done a lot of thinking and research on consistency since we've written the book. We've been talking about actually updating the book more recently to flesh out that section a bit more. And I'll just talk through how we're thinking about it now as well. We do have a tool out there, and actually the American Planning Association is working with us, and they've developed a training module on their eLearn platform, and it's called the Plan Integration for Resilient Scorecard. So it's this idea that we are all siloed, like we've mentioned, even just within planning, but across a community has a network of plans. There's many different types of plans that are out there. And even in small communities that I've worked with have upwards of 15 different plans. And when we're working with communities, we'll typically pull all their plans together and we'll read all the plans and see what's in them. They're often only reading and aware of the plan that they are responsible for, which makes sense, right? Because we're all very busy and this is my job. And so I'm going to focus on economic development. So I'm just going to worry about the economic development plan. But in reality, the policies and actions within that plan are influencing and potentially impacting or exacerbating the vulnerabilities, disaster vulnerabilities as well. So this idea that we don't want to just reference other plans and we don't want to just, this idea of coordination, what does that really even mean? What the tool is that we've developed is we're reading the plans, we're pulling the policies, the action items, the projects, whatever language that particular plan uses. We're pulling it out and we're stacking those policies because those policies typically impact a specific area of the community. So if we know that all of these policies are referring to the downtown, we can stack all those policies on top of one another. And oh, by the way, the downtown is vulnerable to flooding in these parts, in these areas. And we can see that unintended consequences. We didn't realize that we're actually promoting a walkable, dense, urban, wonderful area that we planners love, but we're doing it in the exact same area where we know that there's a lot of risk. So economic development plan will be saying all these wonderful things about how to promote that. And then the hazard mitigation plan is saying, no, we need to do buyouts and people need to be moving away from those areas altogether. And so just that realization and documenting what's going on within your plans, and then having conversations. That's the key, is then bringing everyone to the table and having conversations about what's going on in those plans. Then we can come up with a more targeted and strategic strategy for how we're going to actually address the issues of the downtown. And there's a lot of trade-offs, and it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is retreating, right? But there are things that you can still do and policies you can put in place to mitigate those impacts. So when we're talking about consistency and when we're talking about plan integration, I think it's really vital and important to think of the spatial aspect of how your policies are impacting and exacerbating vulnerabilities.
Yes, conversations. It's always about communication, and communication is the hardest thing that humans do. Well, I want to thank you for taking the opportunity to sit with us and have this conversation. I know as we start moving into the future and, really feels like we're getting hit with more and more disasters. We see worse wildfires. These kinds of events don't seem to be going away anytime soon. What is the biggest takeaway you would like our listeners to leave with from this podcast, and also a nice hook into why they should read your book?
I guess I would just want to emphasize, don't assume that something's being done about it. Number one, the emergency managers, they have a lot on their plate. And so if you are unsure of your hazard risk, you're unsure about the policies that are impacting certain areas, you can start with them. But I would also very much encourage you to look at your policies, your plans, your processes, your procedures that you have within your department and what you can do about it. Because I really do think it takes a whole community approach. Every department needs to have it on their minds. And I mean, really, you just need one person in the room to ask the question of, how does this impact our hazard risks? Or how is this going to impact future risks or climate related issues? So just having that on your minds is critical. And I just want to encourage planners to not take a step back in this, to step forward and play a greater role and really be the conveners that we are so good at being in communities.
I think that's a perfect takeaway for this episode, and just want to echo what Jennifer said. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today about your book, and thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.